Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on the Hellenistic world. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are going to see what happens in the aftermath of Alexander's death. He's recently built the largest empire the world's ever seen, and at 32 young years, he ends up dying, drinking himself to death in the city of Babylon. So we'll start today by setting the scene, thinking about how we got here. From there, we're going to talk about the empty throne. And we'll see how the successors of Alexander go to war to try to claim that throne. And then we'll zoom in on one of the successor kingdoms, the Ptolemies in Egypt, and figure out how to run one of the Hellenistic empires. And then finally, we'll see what's going on culturally throughout the Hellenistic world. So let's go ahead and set the scene. It all begins, of course, in the Bronze Age, around 3000 BC with the rise of civilization. The rise of things like monumental architecture, technologies like writing, large sophisticated cities, complicated art and hierarchies, all these things. And just as quickly as it arises, it collapses during the Dark Age around 1200 BC. And we see the collapse of all those things. People forget how to write. Art becomes far less sophisticated. Settlements become much, much smaller, and burials become much poorer. But in the 8th century BC, we see that start to turn around. And so we get the rise once again of iconographic art. Writing comes back. This time it's used for things like literature. Population's growing, and cities in Greece send out people to colonize other lands. And towards the end of this period, we get developments of things like democracy. But even though democracies are rising, Greece is getting themselves embroiled in a conflict with the largest empire the world had ever seen to this date, the Persians. And somehow, even though they lose the legendary Battle of Thermopylae, Greece is able to defeat the Persians at the naval battle of Salamis and basically stop any further Persian push into the Greek world. Now this ushers in the period of classical Greece, from 480 BC, where the Greeks first win that battle, to 323 BC and the death of Alexander. Now with the death of Alexander, we get a new period that we call the Hellenistic period, right? Hellenistic Greece. And we'll talk a little bit about what that term means later in this lecture. So, the throne sits empty. With Alexander, we get the creation of the largest empire the world had ever seen, including Greece, and then taking over all of Persia and Egypt, making his way all the way to India and doing battle with King Porus in 326 BC. And Alexander is a master kind of battle technician. He's able to come up with incredibly kind of effective warfare concepts, things like that reverse pincer move, and he's an incredibly heroic character individually, charging straight at the tent of Darius III. But in 323 BC, in his final days, as he's kind of drunk himself to death, and his kind of his generals and his kind of number two in line, they're asking, who's going to get your empire? And he just simply says, I'm leaving it to the strongest. So when we talk about his empire, right, starting in the west, going all the way across the old Persian world, all the way to the Indus River Valley. And whoever gets this is going to be the most powerful person in the world. Now, the throne, of course, is empty. So the parallel, of course, is something like Game of Thrones here, where the king has died, and then you get multiple people vying for the Iron Throne. And in this part of the world, the Greek term for these people are the diadokoi, right? And the diadokoi literally translates as the successors. Now, one of the kind of claimants to the throne is Philip Arrhidaeus, and this is the half-brother of Alexander. So same dad, different mom. Another guy is actually the son of Alexander, so he's just about to be born. And if it's a boy, they say, okay, well, he can be the new lord of all of this. And that's going to be Alexander IV, but he's just a little baby at the time. Another claimant is the leader of the cavalry for Alexander's army, a guy by the name of Perdiccas. And if you ever want to read something really, really complex, well, either read the Song of Ice and Fire, or go ahead and read about the Diadokoi and the battles between them. So it's basically everybody ends up killing each other. So Philip Aridaeus, he decides he's going to take over, but then the other guys team up and kill him. But then after Perdiccas takes over, everybody teams up and kills him. And eventually, they end up saying, okay, this is too much killing. Let's go ahead and divide up the empire, and we'll all take little bits of it. And so what you see here are the satrapies, so the provinces of the Persian Empire that Alexander took over. And they've gone ahead and decided that these Greek leaders, these successors, are going to each rule different parts. And so this is what it looks like at the very, very beginning. Now, what's going to happen with that? Think about that. Yeah, people aren't content with just having their little satrapy. So the successors go to war. And we're not going to talk about these wars in depth here, but suffice to say, these successors try to kind of expand their territory. So the Seleucids, led by Seleucus, attacks Antiochus, or the Antigonids here. Ptolemy has run off to Egypt down here. And over the course of about 30 to 50 years, there's a series of battles where they're all vying for power in Alexander's empire. And so we can see the way it looks in 303 BC. We can see 2 years later, after a couple other wars, it looks a little bit different. And we can see 100 years later, it still looks different even further. So the kind of overarching theme of this period is that the throne sits empty. And so the successors kind of try their best to claim territories, and then they go to war to try to get even more territory, right? Take over their neighbor and try to rebuild the empire Alexander once had. And so as they do battle, one of the things that happens is that this brings people into contact with one another. And we're going to see kind of later in the lecture what happens when these ideas are shared. Not only are they fighting each other, but they're also sharing ideas and knowledge across the Hellenistic world. So let's take a look at one of these in particular. And we're going to look at the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt. So Ptolemy was one of Alexander's generals, and at Alexander's death, Ptolemy actually takes the body of Alexander and runs off to Egypt and says, this is where I'm ruling. And the thinking is that Alexander's body will give him kind of some legitimacy, right, to the throne. Now, Egypt had only recently been taken over by Alexander, so they weren't super happy at first, but we can see in Egypt, especially because of the well-preserved archaeological and textual record in things like papyri and inscriptions, how the Ptolemies run their kind of kingdom in Egypt. So he's a Greek dude, but he's ruling a very different type of culture. So one of the things that we see is that he tries his best to essentially rule like a pharaoh. And so this is one of the later Ptolemies, but what you can see is that he's kind of a Greek-looking dude, right? He's got his beard, he has kind of Greek features, and yet he's portraying himself like a pharaoh, going all the way back 3,000 years before this, where we first get the red crown of Lower Egypt and the white crown of Upper Egypt combined. So we see the Greek kings portraying themselves as Egyptian rulers. We also see them adopting Egyptian practices. So one of the practices earlier in this time was that the Egyptian king would marry his sister. And so we see the Greeks, starting with the second of the Ptolemies, take over this practice and do the same thing. We see them starting a ruler cult. So in Egyptian culture, the ruler is actually worshipped like a god. The Greeks are doing the same thing, building temples, very frequently kind of dedicated to the god Horus, who's associated with kingship. So in a way, in addition to worshiping Horus, these temples are also cults for the king himself. And then finally, we see them adopting kind of their own gods, creating new gods in ancient Egypt. And so here we see the god Serapis, and he's kind of a mixture of Apis and of Osiris, and then kind of with a hint of Zeus mixed in there as well. We also see him actually really logistically creating a very heavy bureaucracy. And so we actually have really good records from Egypt because of the papyri that are preserved. Very frequently, they're actually used to wrap things like crocodile mummies and stuff like that. And when you peel them off, you can see these kind of boring texts, these kind of like tax documents and administrative documents. And even though they're not the most interesting thing ever, they actually give us great insight into how the government of Ptolemaic Egypt functioned. And what we see is a highly centralized government with a really heavy kind of bureaucracy, and the government really trying to pull out as much taxation and extract as much in terms of resources from the people as possible. And finally, we see Cleopatra at the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemaic dynasty was actually the longest dynasty ever in Egypt. It lasted like 300 years. And so we see Cleopatra teaming up, first with Julius Caesar, having an affair with him, and later with Julius Caesar's enemy, Mark Antony, and having a love affair with him. And eventually, when it's clear that Mark Antony is on the losing side with Caesar's heir, Augustus, Cleopatra ends up committing suicide, bringing to an end the Ptolemaic dynasty. And as a kind of interesting side note, she's actually the only one of the Ptolemies, the last one and the only one, to learn hieroglyphs. So she takes the time to learn the hieroglyphic, how ancient Egyptian language is written in hieroglyphs. So what's going on culturally? So let's start with this word Hellenistic. Why do we call it the Hellenistic period? Well, let's see what that means, right? So Hellas is actually the term for Greece. So in Greek, the term for Greece is Hellas. And so Hellenistic is essentially kind of a way of saying Greek-ish, right? Kind of Greek-esque, that sort of thing. And so the reason that things are Greek-ish or Greek-esque is because Alexander has conquered this huge area that's not traditionally Greek. And so he's bringing this kind of Greek culture and Greek ideas and Greek cultural elements into areas that already have their own traditions. And those things mix in really interesting ways. So one of the things that we get, even all the way out in India, right, Alexander's kind of last stop before he turned around, we get this type of Gandharan art emerge, right? So the term is Gandharan art, and what it is it's portrayals of like Hindu gods, right, and local local ideas, but doing so with kind of Greek-style sculpture. And so you can see how similar the hairstyles are between Alexander the Great and this piece of Gandharan art from India over here. And so it's a good example of what we mean by the Hellenistic period, where we're talking about Greek elements mixing with local elements to create something kind of entirely new. Now, one of the hallmarks of the Hellenistic period is the development of this kind of elite administrative language that's used all over the kind of Hellenistic world. And we call that Koine Greek. And it's essentially kind of this common language where in ancient Greece, prior to the Hellenistic period, the Greek language has all these different forms. And so it's a little bit different in Athens than it is over on the Ionian coast. And now all of a sudden, it's been simplified a little bit and standardized a little bit. And so rulers all the way out in the Near East could talk to rulers in Egypt, and they could talk to rulers in Greece, all speaking essentially the same language. Knowledge is also being transferred all across the world, right? So remember when I was saying that even though people are fighting with each other, they're also trading with each other, and ideas are being exchanged just as much as swords are being exchanged. And one of the best places we can see this transference of knowledge is at the Library of Alexandria. So it's the second of the Ptolemies, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who starts the library at Alexandria. And the rule is that any ship that comes into the port of Alexandria, if they have any books, if they want to use anything, right, they have to give all their books over to the library to be copied, right? Not just stealing them, but they borrow them, they copy them, and then they give them back. And so the library at Alexandria builds up the biggest repertoire of knowledge the world had ever seen. And you'll notice that the city itself, Alexandria, about to become one of the most important cities in the ancient world, is a very new creation since the time of Alexander, named after him himself. Sculpture we see continue to evolve, again in the Archaic period, very kind of rigid and stiff. During the Classical period, we begin to get a little bit of movement, a little bit of fluidity. That's taken to the next level in the 4th century BC, where the movement kind of continues. We also get the arrival of female nudes. This is the first time this happens in the 4th century BC. And then in the Hellenistic period, we get all this taken to the extreme. So all of a sudden, right, movement isn't just putting a little bit of weight onto one leg. We've got wings, we've got tightly draped garments over the body, revealing kind of every curve of the body. It's almost difficult to believe that this stuff is actually made out of stone. We also get the rise of emotion in sculpture. And so whereas this is very kind of stoic and kind of maybe just one small smile in the Archaic period, by the Hellenistic period, you can see this pathos and you can see the pain in the sculpture of Laocoon, one of the priests and seers from the Iliad. So let's wrap up with a couple concluding thoughts. With the death of Alexander, the Iron Throne is now empty. And what that means is all his successors are vying for power. They're trying to put back together the greatest empire the world's ever seen. And so they fight and they fight and they fight, and nobody's really able to do it. We get Ptolemy down here, we get Seleucus over here, the Antigonids over here, but nobody's able to recreate the entire empire. Now, when we look at Egypt, we can see this kind of interesting style of rule where people are combining these kind of Greek elements along with whatever region they're ruling in. So we can see this Greek-looking guy, right, one of the Ptolemies, but with the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, depicting himself like a traditional Egyptian pharaoh. We see the Koine Greek language be able to link all these disparate kingdoms together. So now all of a sudden, even if you're ruling way over here in the Near East, you can talk to rulers in Egypt using this common Greek language. We see the growth of knowledge with things like the library at Alexandria. And finally, we see continuous developments in things like sculpture, where movement is taken to a new extreme. Again, it's almost impossible to believe this is actually stone. And at the same time, we see emotion becoming a huge part of ancient Greek sculpture. And so all this is happening, people are vying for the throne, nobody's able to quite claim it. And that's essentially the story of the Hellenistic world.